Our conference today is on managing weather and marketing risk is sponsored by the good folks at ADM Crop Risk Services. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you the Vice President of ADM Crop Risk Services. Please welcome Steve Malberger.
Thank you, Stu. I just wanted to come up and do a welcome you guys to Decatur, welcome you to the conference center, but also to this risk management and weather conference, because it's one of the most vital things in the world, really. And I've had a chance with ADM for a long time to live around the world, travel around the world, and one of the things that I know is true, and I've heard it around the world, the American farmer is the most vital part of agriculture in the world. Just to give you a statistic, there's 2 million farmers in the United States. There's 440 million farmers in China. And if you think about, if you break down the U.S. number, 271,000 farmers in America produce 80% of the major commodities. So as you compare the two countries, and really in the world, you guys are the gold standard of agriculture. Every time I've been somewhere, whether I lived in South America or in China, that they see you as the gold medal, the gold standard. They've asked me, can you have farmers come here, teach us how to do what they do? They really look up to you. So we're very thankful for you. You are vital to what we do at ADM, of course, but also to the world. We live in a time where a majority of our young people in America believe that food comes from the supermarket. Okay, they think Walmart goes in the back room and gets the food and brings it out front. But 85% of what we consume in America is produced by the American farmer. So we owe that to us, but our young people are getting away from that. So as I've been around the world, one of the things that people have asked me is, how do the farmers handle these volatile commodity markets? How do they handle that? How does it impact them? And I told them, I said, well, let me tell you a story. I said, think back when the wooden ships were patrolling the coast of the United States and protecting the coast. And the captain's in his cabin plotting and planning the course. And the cry comes out from the crow's nest, enemy ship approaching. And the captain turns to the cabin steward and he says, get my red shirt. And he puts his red shirt on, he goes up to the deck, and they fight the battle against the enemy, and they win the victory. Comes back to his cabin. And the cabin steward says, can I ask you a question, sir? Yes. Why did you put on a red shirt? And he said, because it's all about the confidence in my leadership that my men have. They see me, I could be wounded, I could be cut with the cannons and the muskets, and I wanted them to go on to victory and not be discouraged by seeing me bleeding during the battle. And he said, wow, you're a great leader, sir. And all of a sudden the cry comes out from the crow's nest, 3 more enemy ships approaching. And he says, son, get my brown pants. And I think at times that's the way these markets make us feel. So I think at the end of this great conference today, you're either going to get a lot of good information or a pair of brown pants. So one or the other. So welcome here and thank you for coming.
We want to get started with our conference without any further delay. Our first speaker, Dr. Jim Angel, has been the Illinois State Climatologist since 1997. Began work with the Illinois State Water Survey in 1984 after graduating from University of Missouri. While at the Water Survey here in Illinois, he earned his PhD from the U of I. His interests include climate change and variability, extreme rainfall events, floods, droughts, heat waves, cold waves, the types of things that you would know and think that a climatologist would be fascinated with. And he has... and I know we have been fascinated by the impact of what we've had the last several years. And so that's the reason that I wanted to invite Jim today to visit with you. Because with the drought of last year, the low water on the Mississippi River over the winter, he has become one of the more familiar faces and voices in Corn Belt agriculture. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our first speaker, Dr. Jim Angel.
Thank you, Steve. Well, the good news is I'm not wearing brown pants today, so it means we're not having too much bad news. I work at the Illinois State Water Survey, and it's just down the road in Champaign, Illinois, on the campus of the University of Illinois. And as the name implies, we're the primary agency in the state that looks at the water resources of the state. So there's folks like me that look at things like rainfall and snowfall. We have other people that look at groundwater issues and surface water issues. I know we have several researchers that have looked at issues on Lake Decatur and the basin of Lake Decatur over the years. So we've done quite a bit of work in this area. So we're the primary agency to look at the resources of the state. We're really blessed with great water resources. You know, we've got the Illinois River, we've got the Mississippi River, we got the Wabash and the Ohio, and then we got Lake Michigan, and we're also blessed with quite a bit of rainfall. You know, our average annual rainfall is about 40 inches or so, and this year, even with all the dry weather, we were short maybe about down to about 30 inches, maybe a little less than that in some places. That's actually still better than the average rainfall in Nebraska. So what we would consider a dry year would actually be a pretty good year in Nebraska. So that kind of tells you how good a shape we are in terms of precipitation compared to the folks out west. So no wonder we do such a good job growing corn and soybeans. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2012 drought, kind of get you up to date on where we stand right now, and then we'll look at some forecast maps that have just come out last week from the National Weather Service, kind of give you an idea of how this growing season may shape up. So first of all, I'll talk a little bit since we've talked so much about drought, I thought I'd kind of walk you through some of the definitions of this, because it can be a little confusing, because we kind of use this rather generic term drought when in fact it means different things to different people. It has different timing issues and things like that. So it makes it really hard to come up with a single number that defines the drought. So we kind of have this general definition of some extended period of below average precipitation, and it has to have some impacts on either the environment or the economy or water supplies and things like that. We certainly saw that in spades in this particular year, or this last year. But it is hard to define drought. One of the problems we have with drought is that unlike a snowstorm, you know, we had some snow out this morning, and I think we all stood outside and watched it snow. We could pretty much come in an agreement that when it started, how long it lasted, and how much was on the ground. But you know, with drought, it's really hard to really appreciate when it actually starts and when it ends as well. So we have a lot of questions on that, and you know, usually droughts start out as just kind of an extended period of what we kind of consider nice weather. You know, lots of sunshine, not much rain. You can do a lot of field work if it's at that time of year. And so, like 2012, you know, the first couple of months were not too bad. But as time moved on, it started to go from being nice weather to actually a serious condition. And then as we get into the fall, you know, it starts to rain a little bit, and you start to wonder the first 2 or 3 rains whether, okay, is this the turnaround point? And even today, I'm still getting questions about are we out of the drought and so forth. So we'll kind of look at some of those numbers as we move forward. But just kind of give you a flavor of how hard it is to nail some of this down. And so it's, like I said, it's not a distinct event. The other thing about it is that it means different things to different people. You know, if you're a homeowner in town, it's when, you know, the lawn turns brown and the rose bushes wilt. But if you're obviously in agriculture, it's pretty much what's the impacts on the crops. But if you're a water supply manager, it might be something that lasts over a longer period. So you've got all these different groups looking at this thing with a different perspective. And so that also makes it kind of hard to define drought as well. So if we kind of break down drought into 2 basic categories, and what we saw is certainly very much in play this last year was agricultural drought, and that's basically, you know, obviously during the growing season and is pretty much focused on the lack of precipitation. Now I will say, as an aside, and we'll talk more about this in a minute too, is that you know, we kind of think of most of our droughts are kind of large, slow-moving events, but sometimes you can get some short, intense droughts. In fact, we kind of borrowed a term from flash flooding and called it flash drought. And it's all a matter of perspective because it's, instead of happening in minutes, it happens in weeks. But this year was kind of more of the traditional agricultural drought, where it's a large area and pretty severe impacts, but relatively slow moving. But 2 years ago, we had what I call a flash drought. And Decatur was about at ground zero of that one, where we had plenty of rain all the way up through June, and then all of a sudden it stopped raining. And with the warm temperatures in July, we went to heck of a hand cart pretty quick. And so it was pretty pronounced drought, but it was a very intense but very localized drought. There was just kind of this band of severe drought to the central part of Illinois 2 years ago, so it was very localized. But then this last year was more kind of what a traditional agricultural drought would look like. So this is hydrologic drought. That's kind of the other side of the coin. So agricultural drought is what got a lot of attention this year, but we did have some problems with hydrologic drought. So that's your rivers and streams and lake levels and groundwater issues. And kind of the rhythm of these things or timing is that, at least for us in Illinois, you kind of get into trouble with an agricultural drought first. You see those impacts right away, and then what follows thereafter is usually the water resources impacts. And we kind of saw that this summer as well, where we had, you could see the impact on the crops as early as May and June, but the water levels in some places didn't start to go down until July and August and beyond. And sometimes the hydrologic drought, you're slower to get into it, but you're also slower to get back out of it. So I think even today, we probably have some places in Illinois that are still, from a hydrologic standpoint, still recovering in terms of lake levels and stream flows, and especially groundwater issues. And by the way, this is Lake Decatur. Took this, I think, about the end of July or thereabouts, kind of on the north side there. So it's a pretty dramatic impact. And just kind of an aside, that we watched Lake Decatur like a hawk this year. And Lake Decatur is kind of a unique reservoir in Illinois. My understanding is because it's a small lake on a large watershed. So there's not a lot of storage on it, but it's got such a large drainage area that if you do get rain, and enough rain, and it starts to flow down the river again, that you can recharge it pretty quickly. And so we kind of saw that happen this year. So it was pretty rough looking in that August, September time frame, but then it bounced back with some of the rains we had this fall. And I haven't looked at it today, but I'm sure it looks a lot better than this. This was beyond a boat ramp, so I was kind of down out in the lake bed there. So talk a little bit about the 2012 drought. This was a picture taken by one of our summer interns, and they were in the middle of July cutting the corn for silage. They had a farm just south of Effingham, and it's a dairy operation. So for them, it was fortunate that they could actually take advantage of cutting this corn for silage. But others are not so lucky. If you look at the U.S. drought monitor at the beginning of 2012, everything looked fine. We had clear. The map was clear across much of the Midwest. A little bit of trouble in Minnesota and Iowa and Texas and Oklahoma, but most of the Corn Belt was in great shape. Now, let me just say quickly that the U.S. Drought Monitor is a new enterprise that we've been doing for about the last 12 years, looking at having several state and federal agencies come together and draw one map of the United States. Before this, every agency had their own set of rules, and I might look at one thing, and the federal government might look at something else, and so it's a very cumbersome process to look at drought across the United States. And this one is an attempt to pull all that information together and put it on one map. And I think kind of the highlight for me last year was this map was also used to declare disaster areas with USDA. So I think that's the first time, at least at the national level, they've done that. So if you're in the two worst categories, you're automatically eligible for disaster relief funds at that stage. So major progress. Unfortunately, we haven't done this in the 1930s and 1950s, so we can't compare how those droughts look like. But 2012 started out innocently enough. And then this one is a bar plot of the monthly precipitation departure from the long-term average. So it's a statewide number. So it kind of gives you a broad brush view of how things started out. So January, February, March, and even April, we're getting shorted about an inch, half an inch per month. Nothing really traumatic at that point, but just kind of a series of a sequence of dry months back to back there. So we were concerned by the April time frame, but not overly so. In fact, April was not that bad. But then bottom kind of fell out of the rain gauge in that May, June, July time frame, where suddenly we were coming up short 2 to 3 inches in many places during that time frame. So kind of the reverse of that is that there wasn't a whole lot of rain falling during that time period. In Champaign, we had many cases where not only were we not getting very many rain events, but the ones that we did get were actually fairly small, maybe 1 or 2 tenths of an inch. So nothing too dramatic during that time period. So kind of the core of the drought, as I see it anyway, is this May, June, July time frame. We did see some recovery in August, and then September and October were great. Kind of slid back a little bit there in November, December, and we'll talk more about 2013 here in a minute. So, but the heart of it was by the end of July there. So this is kind of looking at the same story as a map rather than a graph. So that early period, that May, June, July, that January through April period, most of the drought was in I would consider concentrated down here, although we did have widespread dryness throughout the state. So this is color-coded. Some yellows and reds. That means you're short on precipitation for this time period. If you're in the green, you're actually above average. So you see that this area out here was actually on the wet side during this time period, while we had problems with dryness and over by Peoria, and majorly so in southern Illinois and spilling over into Indiana and Kentucky. But even at this point, I wasn't terribly concerned because it was raining to the west of us, and I thought, well, all it takes is 1 or 2 of those systems to just make it over the river, and we'll be back on track to getting out of this dry period. So I was still, except for far southern Illinois, still moderately confident at this stage. But then we got into that core dry period of the May, June, July period, and suddenly everything turned from bad to worse in a hurry. We had a large part of the central United States was short on precipitation. Many places were several inches, so that kind of the oranges there are your areas that were down 8 inches or more during this 3-month period. So another way to look at it, many places out of the 3 months of average precipitation, they only got about 1 month's worth of it. So big impacts in very short order across the Midwest there. And even the areas that were getting the rain earlier on were now turning dry. So it was quite a dramatic shift for this period. So the U.S. Drought Monitor map, no surprise, went from very little drought in the United States to this huge area in the central part of the U.S. In fact, there weren't too many places in the United States that weren't struggling with drought in 2012 in the summertime. So pretty much all of Illinois was in some stage of drought, and pretty much all of the Corn Belt was in some stage of drought, and extended all the way to the Rocky Mountains and beyond. So just overall very dry conditions over this very large area. And so this was, just not an Illinois drought, obviously. It was had significant impacts all across the U.S., and we're still feeling some of those impacts. So if we kind of zoom in on the Midwest here, the two darkest reds, the two darkest reds in Illinois here are the 2 areas that got automatically declared disaster areas, so this area up in here, and then much of the central and southern Illinois during this time period. But the whole state was in some stage of drought. There was just a few little spots here and there. There was over in Mercer County in far western Illinois, there was like one area that did get some rain during this time period, and there was a place over by Kankakee where I made a trip up to Chicago, and there was actually green grass in the median, so there was a little area up there that got it. So there's a few little garden spots, but for the most part, for most of the state, it was very dry conditions and pretty grim circumstances at that point. So if you look at Illinois, each drought has its own personality, so it's always hard to kind of compare them 1 and 1 and you get an exact match. But if you kind of look at just that January through July time period and look at the precipitation totals, this was right up there with the bad guys of 1988, 1934, and 1936. So it was in pretty good company there as far as the precipitation totals at that point in time. That's the statewide numbers. So as I say your mileage may vary, but it's, comparable to the 1988 drought, maybe not quite as bad as some of those droughts in the 1930s, but certainly in that same ballpark as far as being the third driest since our statewide records began in 1895. So pretty significant event up to that point in time. And the other part of the story this last summer was the hot temperatures. And it wasn't just hot here, it was pretty much hot across the United States. In fact, if you laid the map of the U.S. Drought Monitor over the top of this map of temperature departures, you would see there's a pretty good matchup between the two. So a lot of parts of the Midwest and U.S. at this point in time are running 2 to 4 degrees above average on temperatures. And it's no surprise, because what happens is once you dry out that land surface over a large area, the sun that's beating down on you in July, instead of going into evaporating water out of the ground and transpiring moisture from the crops, instead was going into heating that surface and warming up the lower atmosphere. So you saw a lot of hot weather. This summer we had kind of our taste of Oklahoma. That's the kind of the more of the kind of experience that we would have had here rather than our normal warm, humid conditions. We actually had the hot, dry conditions going on. And that translates not only to overall warm conditions, but a lot of days over 100 degrees. Now, there's nothing really magical about 100 degrees, although it's kind of my personal threshold of when I really start complaining about hot weather. So usually in central Illinois, we on average get about 1 day per year where we get 100 degrees, but it's kind of lumpy. We go through periods where we don't get any, and then we'll get like a drought year, we'll get a couple, and then it goes back to not seeing any. So it's a fairly rare event for us to see days over 100 degrees. And so this map here, all across Illinois, many areas saw, in the southern part of the state, saw 10 to 20. In the central part of the state, we had a lot of it in the 9, 10, 12 arena here, and I think that's probably 9. That's probably from Decatur there, and then even in northern Illinois, they were seeing a couple of days up there. And the timing couldn't have been worse. A lot of these happened in that late June, early July period, about the time a lot of the corn was silking and tasseling. So that's the other part of the story on the summertime drought. Now, like I said, that's not unusual to get hot and dry weather. Now, one of the things that happens during these situations is you get what I call a drought feedback loop, so you kind of get stuck in a drought once you get in it. What happens is not only are you heating up that land surface, but because it's so dried out, you've lost that local source of moisture. This is especially important in the summertime. We don't have an exact number, but it's somewhere probably about 20 to 40% of our summertime rainfall taps into the local moisture that gets back into the atmosphere and kind of recycles that. So, it rains on Tuesday, the sun comes out on Wednesday, and you get evaporation and transpiration going on, and you get that moisture back into the atmosphere. So then on Thursday or Friday, when the next thunderstorm comes through, it taps into that and rains back out. Now, the stuff that comes off your field is going downwind now, so it's benefiting somebody else. But in general, there's kind of this local source of moisture that you can lose out on during this drought. And it's pretty much just a summertime thing, because in the spring and fall, we have large low-pressure systems that roll through the state, and they kind of carry their own moisture with them. But in the summertime, it's much more localized. So I would say, like I said, about 20 to 40% is local moisture. The rest comes from the Gulf of Mexico. So, this summer was marked by not only very warm conditions, but also very low humidity. So we've lost that local source of moisture. So you saw a lot of thunderstorms just kind of fizzle out. Saw a lot of forecasts for 60% chance of rain, and you get nothing. Or if you do get rain, you get maybe a tenth or two of rainfall out of those thunderstorms that might in a normal year give you an inch. So definitely saw it start to come into play in that, especially starting about May and continuing on through July. So you kind of can get stuck in these kind of local conditions like that. And this can be very localized. I think we saw this a little bit in the Decatur area in 2011 too, where it turned dry and it kind of got stuck there for a couple of months before it started to rain again. So this is, and it's hard to predict when this is going to occur. So we can kind of see some of that dry weather coming in the winter months, but the question of where that flips from just being story is we do measure evaporation. That's in this case, we kind of literally have this big pan of water that we take measurements every day. So very sophisticated, high-tech equipment. And on a normal summer day, we maybe get about 1 or 2/10 of an inch of evaporation out of this pan. So that'd be a typical summer day. But this last summer, there were a couple of days. There was one day in particular at the end of June where it was 100 degrees out. The sun, it was a blue sky, fairly stiff breeze and very low humidity levels, and we lost 55/100ths of an inch of water out of this pan. So that's, I say a normal would be about 0.1 to 0.2. So we did 0.55. So that's almost 2.5, 3 times the normal rate from this pan. So not only were you not getting the rainfall, but the lots of sunshine, low humidity, and fairly breezy conditions conspired to suck a lot of moisture out of the ground as well. So that's kind of the 1-2 punch of this particular drought. And I was actually all prepared for a long, slow recovery from this summer's conditions, but we did have the remains of Hurricane Isaac roll through the state on Labor Day weekend, and that happens every once in a while. We had a couple in 2008. We actually had the remains of Hurricane Katrina make its way up here in 2005, so it's not unheard of, but it doesn't happen every year. Now, this is probably the first time, at least that I can recall, that we had a major system move in that was coming in over a major drought area. So I think the National Weather Service really kind of struggled on how to forecast this thing. So, some of their forecasts had a very wide range of rainfall amounts, and they were kind of cautioning about flooding issues and things like that because, we just didn't have much experience with this kind of conditions. Now, this one moved in as, obviously it wasn't a hurricane by the time it got to Illinois, fortunately, but it was just a large, slow-moving, rain-producing system that was very juicy, and it's just what the doctor ordered in terms of precipitation as far as recharging that soil moisture, because it fell over 3 days. In fact, the amounts, if you look across the Midwest, the areas in blue got about 3 to 6 inches, so large parts of Missouri and Illinois did very well, but even points eastward, Indiana and Ohio and Kentucky got a fair amount of rain out of all this, and virtually no runoff. I've never seen anything like it. After the end of 3 days, I don't think I saw a puddle. I don't think I saw any water in ditches or anything. I think just like a giant sponge just soaked the whole thing up there. So we didn't see much runoff out of that particular event. Certainly no flooding issues with that, whereas in a more typical year, this would have been a big problem. So Labor Day weekend, the Isaac storm really kind of helped us turn the corner, at least in terms of soil moisture. So if you look at Decatur, kind of zoomed in here. So this is a new product I was kind of experimenting with. So we'll see if this helps you out any. So here's 2012. So the bottom part here is this solid line here is our average precipitation, and it's accumulated throughout the year. So you kind of see how it adds up. So by the end of the year, you've got about 40 inches on average. Here's how it played out in 2012. So we actually did kind of okay through January, February, and then we started to fall behind. So we're a couple inches below the average, say in April. We kind of kept falling farther and farther behind. And we, at this point here, we were down, maybe about 15 inches, well, just shy of that, maybe about 13 inches. And we just kind of stayed that far behind through the rest of 2012. So it did start to rain during this time period, and we started to get some accumulation, but we never quite caught it back up to the long-term average at that point in time. And here's the temperatures up here. So these are the plot of the actual temperatures. This is the average for the year. So it's a nice smooth curve. So you can see there was times back in the March time period that we were getting up into the 60s and 70s, and maybe in a time or two up into the 80s. But then up here we got in the summertime up at over 100 degrees a couple of times too. So some pretty extraordinary stories there. Probably if it hadn't been for the drought, we probably would have been talking about the extraordinary March we had with the warm weather and the fact that the fruit trees all blossomed and they got hammered by the April frost. So that probably would have been the story. here's kind of, if you like numbers, here's the numbers for Decatur. So here's 2011. So here's that flash drought starting in July, August, and a little bit of recovery in September. But this is kind of the core area for the two critical months where it virtually stopped raining in Decatur. And I remember coming to the Farm Progress Show and eating a lot of dust that year. It did start to rain a little bit in the fall. Probably didn't catch back up, but we actually, by the end of for the annual total, we actually close to the long-term average of about 40 inches. Then we get into 2012, and we're almost right off the bat. We're just keep running short on precipitation. So very dry March, maybe a little bit better in April, but then dry, and really dry in June and July. A little bit of recovery, and here's the rates of Isaac, and a little bit more recovery in October, and then we kind of slid back a little bit in November and December. Now, so far in 2012, we're doing a little better. We were actually closer, a little bit above average on both January and February. So we're looking a little better at this point in time. So here's the line of snow blowers at Lowe's a couple of weeks ago in Champaign. I think you guys are in the same boat we are. Not much snowfall this year. In fact, if you look at this winter's snowfall, this is a map of snowfall departures. So these areas have gotten a lot of snow in the last week or so. And then there's this band up through here that was from a big storm event right after Christmas that dumped a lot of snow in southern Illinois. But we're kind of in this big hole, big donut hole of very low snowfall values for us. So, but that's not necessarily a problem. Well, I'll show you that in a minute. But the other day I did something that somebody had asked me about. Well, how does the start of this year compared to the start of 2012? So I looked at this is the up through yesterday the precipitation departures for 2012. So you can see that already in 2012 we were seeing some significant dryness, not only in southern Illinois but large parts of the Midwest. It's just an overall dry pattern for those first 2 months of 2012. This is what it looks like now. This is all these areas in green are above average. In fact, we've got some areas that are 3 to 4 inches above average for the first 2 months. So it's pretty incredible. That's almost an extra month's worth of precipitation in southern Illinois. So like I was showing for the numbers for Decatur there, we're in much better shape overall, not only here but across the Midwest compared to the start of 2012. So that gives me some hope that already that 2013 is going to be a different story than what we saw in 2012. This is U.S. drought. It's the modeled soil moisture map across the United States. In the wintertime, we don't do that many soil moisture measurements. USDA kind of pulls back on their number reports. We have some sites out there that we can take measurements, but if the ground freezes, it throws them off. So we don't do that in the wintertime. So there's not a whole lot of information out there. So you can use soil moisture models, and they're kind of okay. They kind of give you a general picture of what's going on. So if you look at Illinois, there's a few stretches, a little bit of shading of the tan there. So maybe an inch or so short in kind of the general area, and then some areas up here are a little bit on the dry side. And most of the problem here is that the soils are still fairly frozen up there. So they've gotten some rain events, but it's fallen on frozen soil. So it hasn't done much for soil moisture in northern Illinois. But here in the central part of the state, we've had some freezing and thawing events. So I think some of that water has been able to work its way through the system. And once things kind of warm up a little bit, we'll get a better picture of it. But probably the thing that catches my eye is there's a large part of the central U.S. to our west here of areas colored in the darker shades of yellow and some reds there. So this is a metric system, but there's several areas that are 4 inches or more short on soil moisture already. We don't have a lot of soil moisture to work with anyway. So big trouble out west. We're kind of okay in this part of the country. This is what the U.S. Drought Monitor looks like now. So you remember before, it was pretty much the whole U.S. was covered in drought. Now you've got the core of the drought area has actually shifted westward and is now out on the high plains area. So pretty much from Texas Dakotas are facing drought, and some of those guys are looking at the second or even third year of drought conditions out there. I think parts of Oklahoma and Texas, this has been a long, slow drought. And, it's kind of typical. Those guys out west tend to have many more multi-year droughts than we do here in Illinois. So that's is kind of the nature of the climatology of those two areas. So a large part of the High Plains and the western half of the Corn Belt is not looking real good right now. They've got some rains, got some snow, which will help, but they still have a long ways to go in terms of recovery. So here's the Mississippi River. This is the river gauge just south of St. Louis at Chester. 2 years ago, they were in flood stage. So here's the flood stage right here, this red line. So, 2 years ago, we were blowing up levees and worrying about losing towns. Then it kind of reverted back to more average conditions in the rest of 2011. Even early 2012, we really didn't see much of a response to the drought until about July, and then all of a sudden it started to drop down and was significantly lower levels. And so this is the area that we really started to get worried about closing down the Mississippi River, kind of that November, December time frame. It's recovered a little bit, and most of it's because we've had enough rain in the Illinois River Basin that's flowed into the system and kind of helped recharge that. If you look at the rest, if you kind of look at the Mississippi River Basin as a whole, it's not in very good shape right now. And a lot of that area in the Missouri Basin and the upper Mississippi above St. Louis is in some stage of drought conditions right now. So they're really feeling the pinch. Anyway, we're going to probably be still struggling with river levels on the Mississippi in 2013. I think we've gotten some rains now that kind of helped in the short term, but I think the long term, we're just going to continue to have problems out there until we get this large part of the upper basin moistened back up. And it takes a while. Like the Mississippi River, if you think about it, first you got to get all those little creeks flowing, and the larger creeks, then the smaller rivers, and the larger rivers, and then it flows in that main channel. So it takes it about 6 months for that to all drain out and show up on the main channel, but then to get it going again, you got to fill all those back up, and that takes several months again. So by the time you get to the Mississippi, it's a very slow changing, but that can both help and hurt you. So in this particular case, it'd probably be several months before we see a sustained recovery from that. And I'd also say, as a side note, we're also having problems with low lake levels on Lake Michigan and Superior, and that's because we've had a lot of drought up in this area the last couple of years, and they've also had very warm winters, so they don't have any ice cover, so they're getting evaporation in the wintertime. So we've got all kinds of problems on Lake Michigan as well. So that's another major. So these are having all kinds of impact on shipping of commodities throughout the Midwest. So I guess it's a good time to buy stock in rail. That's my tip for the day. So if you look at stream flow, this is from yesterday. USGS has rain gauges or stream gauges across the state, and they got them color coded. So if it's in green, that's close to average for this time of year. If it's blue, it's actually on the wet side, and if it's there's a few that are on orange, so a little bit on the low side over here. But if you look at this map from a year ago, this would all be in oranges and reds. So we were already seeing problems with stream flow a year ago that we haven't had to deal with this year. So much better conditions in terms of stream flow. I always kind of consider stream flow a good overall measure of the health of the hydrologic system, because if you got good soil moisture, and you got good groundwater levels, those are the two main ingredients to stream flow. So if the streams are looking good, that means those other two systems are probably in pretty good shape too. And if you got good stream flow, it means you're also filling up the reservoir. So I kind of use it as overall health of the whole hydrologic system. We'll kind of switch over from where we stand now to where we're going, or we think we might go. We talked a lot in years past about El Nino and La Nina, and all that is we're just looking at sea surface temperatures out in the Pacific Ocean. And so we got satellites, we got buoys out there that we can look at data. And so here's a temperature map using satellite data. So there's Australia, there's South America, here's the equator. This is the part that we watch every year to see what's going on. So if there's a lot of red over here indicating warm temperatures, different phases of the same pattern there. So it does swing back and forth between unusually cold waters to unusually warm waters. But you do get that in-between period, and that's where we are right now. There's nothing going on out there in terms of El Nino or La Nina. We kind of came off a mild La Nina event last year, but really nothing going on in the Pacific right now. It's pretty close to where we'd expect it to be for this time of year. So that's not going to be a forecasting tool that we can use this spring and summer like we've had in some other years. But there are some other techniques we have. The National Weather Service puts out these outlooks every month. I think they do it on I think it's like the third Thursday of the month, I think is the time frame on those. And so they just came out last Thursday. And in this case, since they don't have El Nino and La Nina, they can't look at that. But they also have some climate models that they run out to 6 months. They also look at trends. So if we've had a trend towards wetter springs, they'll kind of incorporate that into the maps as well. So here's their outlook for March. And on the left-hand side is the temperature. The right-hand side is precipitation. So the color coding is on the temperature side, they've got us in this very large area of an increased chance of above average temperatures going into March. So we got 1 day left of February here. So we'll see how that plays out in March. And they also have this large area here, not only in Illinois, but the Great Lakes region of above average precipitation. So not quite extending out to the period, the place where they need it the most, but at least in the eastern half of the Corn Belt, looks like March could be on the warm and wet side. Now, if you look at the March, April, May period, they do a 3-month one, too. Kind of the same story. So above average temperature, increased chance of above average temperatures for Illinois, as well as increased chance of above average precipitation. So that kind of theme is carried over into the rest of the spring. Now, this time last year, I don't think they were calling for anything like this. I think March they were expecting to be a little bit on the wet side, but I think really weren't saying much about it. Certainly didn't look like this. And if this theme of warm, wet spring sounds familiar, it's because it is. If you look at 8 of the last 10 springs, we've actually had above average temperatures, and 8 of the last 10 springs above average precipitation. So you kind of think, we're in this trend towards drier springs, but really other than 2005 and 2012, we've actually had more tropical wet weather in the springs than we had otherwise. So 2 oddball years, but the overall pattern has been more towards warmer and wetter springs. This is their outlook for kind of the summer months, June, July, and August. So you still have this large area of above average temperatures across not only Illinois, but much of the U.S. by this point in time. But they're not saying anything about precipitation. It's the map for us is clear at that point. So it's what I call a neutral forecast. They don't show any increased risk of being too dry or too wet at that point. So just kind of neutral on that condition. That's pretty typical in the summertime because a lot of time our summertime precipitation is dictated more by local conditions and not by as much by El Nino and other large-scale features. So it makes it a lot tougher to forecast. So you tend not to do as many precipitation forecasts. But the temperature one is kind of interesting. If you look at some of there's some kind of behind-the-scene models that you can look at, and those are showing some tendency to be on the warm side. I think maybe some of it might be reflecting the fact that it's because we have such a large part of the United States to the west of us, it's still so dry that I think they're expecting those warm temperatures to go hand in hand with that dry conditions as well. So I think that may be part of what's driving this. So I think probably I'd be more confident in their temperature forecast out west. I think for Illinois, not quite convinced that it's going to play out that way. But we'll see. If we remain fairly wet this summer, we should be all right, even if it is a little bit on the warm side. And by the way, when they show maps like this of increased chance of above average temperatures, they're not saying it's going to be 115 degrees here. It just means that the average temperatures are going to be about 2 to 3 degrees above average. So doesn't necessarily mean catastrophic heat. And if you look at summertime, it's kind of a little bit of a coin toss. 6 out of 10 have been above average on temperatures, and 6 out of 10 have been above average on precipitation. So, or you could say on the other hand, that 4 out of 10 have been below average on those two counts. So there's not that kind of a clear signal like we saw in the spring times of having a tendency one way or the other. So it's more of a mixed bag at that point. So here's their forecast for the drought. So this really comes as no surprise. They're expecting the drought to persist out west. Some recovery in Missouri, Iowa, and the Dakotas. So we're kind of getting into the western half of the Corn Belt and here. But you get out in Nebraska and Kansas and beyond, they're expecting widespread drought conditions to continue for the next 3 months. So those guys, I think, are going to be in real tough shape as we move forward into the 2013 growing season. And that may be the story for 2013 if I was going to predict where the attention is going to be. I don't think we will no longer be at ground zero on this one. I think it's going to be farther west. So I'll leave it with one last thing here, one last bit of good news. If you look at Illinois precipitation patterns, this is the annual precipitation. It's the statewide numbers from 1895 to the present. And you can see here are the individual years. So here's all the dry years. Here's all the wet years. If you look overall, all these really dry years are pretty much singular events. In other words, they're pretty much on their own. They're one-off events. So we really, and I've been asked this several times about the risk of drought since we've had one in 2012. But most of these really dry years, here's 2012, are usually pretty much by themselves. There's very few cases. 1988, 89, here's 88, here's 89. It was dry in 89, but certainly not as bad as 88. There are a couple of years in the 1950s where we had a string of dry years in a row. So we did have some impacts there. Here's the 50s. So a couple of dry years in a row there. But for the most part, the really bad ones are pretty much one-off events. And to give you a perspective of the years 2012, we've had several down in here in the earlier part of the record that were much drier than the annual time frame than what we saw this year. So the other thing about this graph that I also find interesting is that there's a 5-year running average going through this data, and it's just to kind of smooth out some of the wild variations and kind of give your eye a chance to kind of look at overall patterns. So, and it's color-coded so that if it's brown, that means it's below the long-term average. If it's green, it's above the long-term average. So there's a lot of brown in this 1895 to about 1965 period here. After 1965, there's a lot of green and not much brown. So we're kind of in a period in the last 20 or 30 years of wetter conditions overall and fewer droughts. 2012 was rough and 1988 was rough, but they were actually fairly widely spread or fairly far apart. You go back to the 1930s and 1950s, and we had some earlier droughts that were as bad or worse than what we saw this last year, and they were occurring much more frequently. So we seem to be in this, at least in an overall pattern of wetter conditions. So the fact that we rarely get a repeat in terms of the drought years, and the fact that we're in a fairly wet pattern compared to the earlier decades also makes me feel a little more comfortable about 2013 as far as the risk of drought. There's always a risk of drought in any particular year, but I don't think we're in an increase. We are not in an increased risk for drought in 2013. I think all the arrows are pointing towards that not being a problem. Now, having said that, these are kind of the big picture numbers. I would say in Illinois, there's always some part of the state in the summertime that gets into trouble. Sometimes they can be very small areas, and believe it or not, even in 1993, when we had the flood on the Mississippi River, there are a few parts of Illinois that were actually dealing with dry weather that year. So you can't get these kind of localized conditions, but I think overall, the risk of drought is not going to be a big concern in this coming year. So here's just kind of to fill in the blanks here. Here's the same thing for temperature. So again, we've got the cold years and the warm years. Now here in the warm years, we do kind of get more back-to-back cold years and back-to-back warm years. So that's a little different story. But The other thing is that here's that same 5-year running average and color-coded. So these areas are cold, warm, cold, warm. So it kind of got this rhythm going in Illinois anyway of 2 or 3 decades of temperatures going one way and then they go in the other way and then back and forth. So throw it back open to questions.
Anyone have questions? Yeah.
Yes. Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. So, yeah, I'm not too worried about northern Illinois right now. It's just kind of a question mark because until the soils kind of thaw out, we won't know for sure. And I didn't have it up here, but the USDA came out with, in the wintertime, they just do a once-a-month report. So they came out with one, I think it was on Monday or Tuesday of this week. And in this part of the state, probably no surprise, the topsoil moisture was in pretty good condition. There was still some, I think it was like 33% was a little short on the subsoil moisture, but that doesn't surprise me. The topsoil is fully recovered, and we've still got some recharging to do it in the subsoil moisture. But we've got several more weeks to go, and March is a pretty wet time of year, so we could easily recharge the rest of that profile as we move forward. Yes.
How long has the Nino family been around?
Yeah. A couple of years ago when I gave a talk like this, somebody said, well, I didn't know I needed to speak Spanish to forecast the weather in Illinois. So, it's interesting, the El Nino, La Nina thing. There's probably just a handful of experts in the entire world that was looking at this before the 1990s. I think there was a big event in 1982-83 that kind of started to get people's attention, but it was really the 97-98 event that really got the whole world's attention. And before the 97 event, I would have said, well, its impacts on Illinois, they're probably pretty remote. But you start looking at the numbers and doing the number crunching, and you do see some patterns. Now, it doesn't always play out that way, but there is kind of a tendency, for example, with El Nino to have mild winters, with La Nina to kind of a tendency to have dry summers and so forth. So there are some general patterns that you can pull out of these things. The nice thing about El Nino and La Nina that I didn't mention is that these are slow moving and slow developing things, so we can kind of see them coming up to 6 months in advance. So that gives us some pretty good advance warning of what's going to happen. There's some other things out there, the Arctic Oscillation and some other things in the alphabet soup of acronyms that we look at, but we don't have any forecast skill in those. So we know what the impacts are, but we can't forecast it, so it doesn't help much as a forecast tool. But El Nino and La Nina and what's happening in the Pacific Ocean, that's a great tool because we can see it coming 6 months in advance. Yes. Yeah, there has been some look at sunspot activity. That I know I think about a year or two ago, we were at record low levels on sunspot activity. And kind of the way it works with sunspots is if you have a lot of sunspots, it ends up that the sun kicks out more radiation during that time frame. So you kind of think of the sun as a light bulb, and sometimes it's not a 60-watt light bulb, sometimes it's 59 watts, sometimes it's 61 watts. And that's kind of what we're seeing with that. And how that plays out with what happens here in Illinois is it's kind of unclear at this point, how some variations. I mean, kind of you think, kind of logic would dictate, okay, well, if the sun is varying in intensity, that's got to have an impact on our climate. But how that plays out in terms of temperature or anything else, it's a lot murkier. It's actually pretty hard to tease out. So I suspect that as we look at this more and more and get more experience with it, we'll probably be able to detect more impacts on that. But yeah, I do know it was unusually mild or unusually quiet in the last year or two, and But I've lost track of it now, so it must have started to kick back in because it's not news anymore. So it must be back up to the average numbers.
Anyone else? Going once, twice. Jim, thanks.
Thank you.